Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to this conference today here at UCLA. My name is Randall Johnson, and I'm Interim Vice Provost for International Studies and head of the International Institute here at UCLA. So on behalf of the university and the International Institute, I'd like to welcome all of you to this timely and important conference. With media focus of late largely on Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, Pakistan, along with the spotlight on nations of the Arab Spring, the public's attention has momentarily diverted from Iran. But Iran obviously remains a significant player in the region and an important actor on the global stage, one that we cannot afford to ignore. The mission of the Burkle Center of International Relations is to shed light on the complex issues of the day. And today the center has assembled an impressive array of experts to help illuminate issues surrounding Iran and its relations with the international community. The conference forms part of a long tradition of interest in Iran here at UCLA, and it's part of a broader initiative to further develop Iranian studies at the university. Created in 1979, the Burkle Center is UCLA's and Southern California's premier interdisciplinary center for the study of global affairs. It's an integral part of the International Institute's family of 22 multidisciplinary research centers that study world regions and global issues, preparing students for the 21st century. The Burkle Center is a significant sponsor of research, teaching, and outreach on campus. It is renowned for its dynamic programming, such as visits and lectures by eminent figures in world affairs, including Kofi Annan, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, CNN's Anderson Cooper, and Christopher Hitchens. This year alone, the Burkle Center has sponsored numerous important speakers, ranging from Admiral Mike Mullen to Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, along with countless academics, practitioners, and prized authors. The Burkle Center is also known for its lectures and panels on breaking news topics, an impressive array of fellows, senior fellows, one of whom, General Wesley Clark, will be participating in this conference, and another foreign minister of Thailand, Dr. Kantati Supamongkong, is here with us this morning, as well as an award-winning internship program and international career panels. I would like to thank all of today's speakers who come from a wide range of internationally respected think tanks and academic institutions, as well as experienced military experts and notable figures from other areas of expertise. It's important to have a diverse array of opinion on controversial issues, whether we agree with those opinions or not. And I'm pleased to welcome all of our participants here to UCLA. I would also like to thank the Burkle Center Director, Cal Rostiala, and his staff for putting this conference together. And now here to tell you more about the Burkle Center and the conference is Center Director and UCLA Professor of Law, Cal Rostiala. Cal.
Thank you, Randall. Good morning, everyone. As Randall said, I'm very pleased, and I know he's pleased, to see so many of you here today for our conference. Iran has a long and proud history, and today remains, as Randall noted, a central player in the region and on the global stage. And that is really going to be our focus today, what Iran's relationship with the world is and how it can be improved. We brought together a terrific group of experts. As Randall noted, it's a diverse group. I was amazed at how many wonderful people were willing to come out and talk about this issue, so I'm really very happy with our lineup. Let me say a little bit about why we wanted to do this and about how the day will unfold. So throughout history, disfavored states have found ways to alter their status over time and to improve their relations with others. Likewise, great powers have often worked with former enemies to rehabilitate them and to reset relationships. So nearly 40 years ago, for example, 40 years ago this coming February, President Nixon made his famous trip to China to meet with Chairman Mao. And in doing so, recast a relationship that for decades had been largely silent between the two nations, and in fact in which there was vilification on both sides by important players within each society. There are many other examples of such transformations in relationships, including, and this is an interesting one in light of current events, Libya, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Today's conference will focus on how Iran's relationships may be transformed in a similar way, how it might return to a place of cooperation and amity with great powers and with regional neighbors. So, and let me add, of course, we have a particular interest in the United States, and we will talk in the final panel about that very important relationship. So before we turn to the opening panel, which I will chair, I want to just say a little bit about how things will work on the panels, and I also want to apologize for the unfortunate cancellation of our keynote. We were going to have a conversation with Nicholas Burns, Renee Montagne, and Congressman Howard Berman. Nick had to remain in Boston due to urgent family matters, and Howard Berman has to be in Washington for urgent, I should say, political matters. So unfortunately, we won't have the keynote that we had hoped to have. However, there is a silver lining, and that silver lining is that we have a bit more latitude in our schedule and a chance to hear from our panelists and to discuss issues with them a bit more. So we'll be more relaxed about our schedule as a result and have time for lunch outside as planned. I've asked the panelists to keep their remarks brief, and the panels will be interactive in the sense that we will aim to have a discussion and debate amongst the panelists and the moderators, and then open that up to all of you. So there will be ample time for questions. If you have a question, please wait to be called on. Of course, we have roving microphones. Wait for the microphone. Please keep your questions concise and on point. There are many of us here, and we do want to make sure that we have a chance to hear from many different people. So again, wait for the microphone. If you have a question, wait to be called on. And finally, I do thank you all for coming, and I look forward to a terrific day of discussion. Thank you very much. Let me please invite the panelists up for the first panel. While our panelists are assembling, let me introduce the topic of this panel. You do have a program. You should all have a program on your seat if you weren't given one coming in. This panel, the aim of this panel, is to set the stage for the day's discussion by thinking about some of the broader issues that are raised by our topic. So, how can so-called rogue states be rehabilitated? How can they become members in good standing in the international community? How can acrimonious relationships between states become peaceful, if not friendly? What does history and theory tell us about these issues? So these are the kinds of general questions that we want to consider. How can relationships be transformed? What can we learn from other examples? We'll, of course, talk a bit about Iran, but my intention in setting this panel in the beginning of the day was to provide a firmer foundation, a broader foundation, a comparative perspective to think about how relationships might be transformed. And to do that, I was very pleased to bring together three really terrific speakers on this topic. So let me briefly introduce them. They have longer bios in the program that you have, but I'm just going to briefly say who they are. And they'll speak in this order, starting on the far left, my far left, your far right of this panel. Charles Kupchan is Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown, and Whitney Shepherdson, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Sitting next to him, directly to his right, is Bruce Jentleson, Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University, and until recently, Senior Advisor to the Policy Planning Director at the U.S. Department of State. To Bruce's right, my colleague in the UC system, Etel Solingen, who's Chancellor's Professor of Political Science at UC Irvine, and President-elect of the International Studies Association. So again, they will make some opening remarks in that order. And then I will ask a few questions of the panel. We'll talk a bit about some of the issues that they raise. We'll open it up to you after. So, Charles.
Yeah, go up there.
Yeah, as you like. If you want to stand or sit, whatever's most comfortable.
Thank you, Cal. And appreciate the opportunity to participate in what is a very timely and important subject. I'm going to make some generic remarks about the question of engagement, the issue of when and under what circumstances long-standing rivalries come to an end. Because I think that the purpose of this opening panel is to try to create a framework, a groundwork for some of the more detailed discussions of the U.S.-Iranian and the international community-Iranian relationship. And here I'm going to be drawing on a recent book that I published called How Enemies Become Friends, in which I looked at 20 different historical cases to try to figure out when and under what circumstances do long-standing rivalries come to an end. How is it that today the United States and Great Britain enjoy a special relationship, whereas from the late 1700s until about 1900, they were bitter enemies? How is it that today you can drive from France to Germany without stopping, without seeing a border guard, without changing money, when for hundreds of years that line between the two countries was the site of an enormous amount of bloodshed? How is it that Brazil and Argentina today have an undefended border, when for many, many decades they were bitter enemies? This is the question that I think it to some extent sheds light on the core question that Cal wants us to look at today. How do we bring countries in from the cold? Another way to ask that question is, how do you get long-standing rivals to call it quits, to say, enough already? Let's try to put our relationship on a better footing. The first insight I'd offer up is that the debate about to engage or not to engage is, in my mind, not really a serious debate. And what I mean by that is that not engaging is, to me, not a policy. We tried that during the Bush administration. We had the axis of evil. We wouldn't talk to Iran. We wouldn't talk to North Korea. We wouldn't talk to countries we didn't like. What happens? Those countries do whatever they want. They build nuclear weapons. They test nuclear weapons. And so it seems to me that the issue before us today is not should we talk to Iran or should we not talk to Iran. It is how do we engage? What is the best way to try to get to some kind of compromise, to some sort of settlement in which the core questions between the two countries and between Iran and the international community are resolved peacefully? May not happen. We may find ourselves at war with Iran in the not-too-distant future. But there is really no debate between engagement or not engagement. Not engagement is not a policy. And in the 20 cases that I looked at across time and across space, beginning in the 13th century and ending over the last few years, long-standing rivalries come to an end when the parties sit down and engage and find a way to resolve the issues. There is an alternative, and that is when one side attacks and destroys the other side, rebuilds the government, puts in a new constitution, as in Germany and Japan in World War II. That's another pathway. We may get to that, but that is certainly a less desirable outcome than getting to peace without war. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for coercion. And I think in the case of Iran, there is an enormous amount of room for coercion, in the sense that to get Iran to take seriously negotiations over its enrichment facilities, to get Iran to reconsider its position vis-a-vis terrorism, will require not just putting offers on the table, but making it more attractive to Iranian elites to pick up that offer. But the idea that we can somehow coerce Iran into submission, the idea that we can use sanctions and they will fold and say, sure, whatever you want, that's not going to happen. What we might be able to do is use sanctions, use pressure to guide them toward a door in which negotiations are open and some kind of resolution to the problem is found. So you need to have equal parts carrots and sticks. Sticks are an important part of this. I'm someone who supports sanctions, who supports pressure, but I'm not someone who believes that we can get to a resolution simply through pressure. Pressure has to be used smartly to guide and try to guide different coalitions and different actors in Iran toward yes. Second point, regime type. I think in the American scholarly community and in American politics, we tend to be taught and we tend to be told that democracies are peace-loving and good, and that autocracies are ugly, nasty, and warlike, and that we should therefore look out at the world and choose our friends and the people with whom we will engage on the basis of their regime type. And it is that proposition that to some extent encourages us to not engage Iran, to not engage Cuba, to not engage Syria, to not engage Burma. That's a mistake. Another insight that emerged from the historical studies that I've done is that regime type is not a good predictor of when enemies can become friends, and that autocracies make peace with autocracies, autocracies make peace with democracies, and we do ourselves a disservice when we assume that the nature of a country's domestic institutions are a good predictor of the way that they behave internationally. When Brazil and Argentina embarked down the path to peace in 1979, both regimes were military juntas. When Indonesia reached out to Kuala Lumpur, to Malaysia, in 1965, 66, 67, and founded ASEAN, Malaysia was governed by Suharto, one of the great thugs of the 20th century. He was nonetheless a peacemaker abroad. So I think that we need to set aside our instincts to look at regimes and say, we don't like this regime. Should we like the Iranian regime? No. Is the Iranian regime detestable? Yes. Does that mean that we can't do business with them if they're willing to do business with us? No, because too much is at stake to turn our back on a regime, even if we think it doesn't deserve respect. A second point that I would make in this regard is that engagement of autocracies, engagement of repressive regimes, when it works, often leads to the downfalls of those regimes. Why? Because they require confrontation with the international system to legitimate themselves. Did rapprochement between Brazil and Argentina undermine military juntas? Yes. Both countries were democracies by 1985. When Sweden and Norway edged toward rapprochement in 1905, what happened to the Swedish military-run, aristocratic-run government? It collapsed, and Sweden became a democracy. Did Indonesia and Malaysia edge toward democracy after they made peace with each other? Yeah, it took some time, but yes. And that's because the absence of confrontation externally undermines regimes that rely upon confrontation for domestic legitimacy. The third point in this respect, I think that when it comes to our optimistic views of democracy, some certain sobriety is in order here. And let me just take the example of the Arab Spring. I think that in general, the conversation that we Americans have had on the Arab Spring and the soundings that have come from Washington are generally naive. Is the Arab Spring and the emergence of a grassroots desire for autonomy and dignity uplifting? You bet it is. Is the emergence of democratic movements in the Middle East something that we should see as, in the near term, creating a more stable environment, an environment in which the United States will find it easier to do business in the Middle East? Absolutely not. What is likely to unfold in the coming years as a result of the Arab Spring is, in my mind, a lot of things that are not welcome. Let's look at Egypt. What has been in the front page of the New York Times in the past few weeks? Well, today it's that the country is being overrun by crime. 2 days ago it was that Muslims and Christians are killing each other. 2 weeks ago it was that the new Egyptian government is now cozying up to Tehran and Hamas. Is this good news? No. What would happen if we throw Assad under the bus? Syria will probably come apart at the seams. Right? I'm not someone who thinks that democracy and Islam or democracy and the Arab world don't mix, but I'm someone who believes that we need to be sober in thinking through how to get from an autocratic world in the Middle East to a democratic world in the Middle East. And top-down incremental change is, in my mind, a much better way to get there than grassroots revolutions from below, which are likely, in my mind, to do two things. One, make political Islam far more influential in the Arab world. 95% of Egyptians want more religion in politics. 2/3 of Egyptians believe that civil law should be based on Sharia law. This does not suggest to me that we are seeing the emergence of liberal democratic regimes in the Middle East, far from it. The final point I would make is that on questions of engagement, democracy and democracies who engage are at risk to some extent, in as much as the domestic politics of engagement are as difficult as the diplomacy of engagement. Countries and leaders that reach out to their enemies always face obstacles at home. Some of the most significant obstacles to rapprochement between the United States and Russia, the United States and Cuba, the United States and Iran, are not in Moscow, Havana, or Tehran, they're in Washington. And that's simply because when leaders reach out to their enemies, they take enormous political risks. And the same is true when it comes to the counterparts. Our reset with Russia almost went up in flames because the Senate came close to rejecting the START treaty late last year. The treaty passed, but if it had not, it would have given us a clear sense of how important domestic politics are to supporting and guiding the engagement process. Let me end by offering simply a few thoughts about where we are in the engagement process between Washington and Tehran. The ball, in my mind, is decidedly in Tehran's court, and that in general, engagement works through a multi-stage process in which one side makes the offer to another, puts concessions on the table, and waits for the other side to reciprocate. When it was the U.S. and Britain, it was Britain backing down in a dispute over South America. When it was Brazil and Argentina, it was an issue of a big dam on the Parana River, which Argentina said, fine, after a decade, let's build it. When it was Norway and Sweden, it was a decision to dismantle the forts on their common border. Well, I think the United States has made clear that it is ready to talk to Iran. It has put reasonable proposals on the table when it comes to uranium enrichment. Those proposals have been rejected. And now the clock is ticking as Washington legitimately waits for the Iranian regime to make some kind of serious counteroffer. From the perspective of Tehran, I think they probably see things in a mixed way now. I think it's safe to say that the Iranian leadership should understand that they have in Washington a government that is about as good as it gets when it comes to the question of engagement. A Republican would be much tougher. Most other Democrats would be tougher. I'm not sure that Hillary Clinton would be doing what Barack Obama is doing. In fact, they disagreed with each other as candidates about whether the United States should talk to enemies. So to some extent, I think Tehran should realize it is pushing on an open door. This is an opportunity to engage the United States that may never come along again. In terms of Iran's regional perspective, I think they're kind of seeing a mixed set of incentives and disincentives. Is the Arab Spring good for Iran or bad for Iran? I would say in the long run, it's bad for Iran. And that's because if these protests lead to the gradual liberalization of politics in the region, it to some extent drains away support for the theocratic regime that exists in Iran today. In the short run, I think Iran has been dramatically strengthened by recent developments in the Middle East. The United States basically knocked off the main balancer to Iran, Iraq. Iraq is going to be weak for the foreseeable future. Egypt, the other main conservative balancer to Iran, is essentially trying to make it through the day. It may not. We don't know. Syria, the same way. Syria is on a respirator. And then the fourth major player in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, they are shaking in their boots. They are watching the Shiites in the eastern provinces, worried that they're going to be looking at what's happening in Bahrain. The Saudi monarchy is not stable. The king is close to 90. The next generation divided over what comes next. So when Iran looks out at the broader region, I think they see a region that is pretty much flat on its back because of domestic political instability. Now, does that give them an incentive to stand their course and be tough? Or does it give an incentive, a confidence to deal with Washington? I don't know. But I do know that if engagement fails, the United States will be faced with two options. One, letting Iran go nuclear. Two, bombing Iran. Neither outcome is very attractive. That leads me to the final statement that I'd like to make today, and that is that engagement doesn't always work. Engagement is difficult, but when it works, it makes the world a much safer place. Engaging Iran strikes me as not high chance of working, but the door should be open until the 11th hour, because the failure of engagement leads us, as I said, with two extremely unattractive options: a nuclear Iran or war with Iran. I don't think we want to go down either of those roads. Thank you.
Let me also start by thanking Cal for the invitation. I actually started my teaching career in the early 1980s at your northern neighbor, University of California, Davis, and it's always good to come back to California, even though it's not Northern California, it's Southern California, but we learn to love both. And let me also say, as now a faculty member at Duke University, the home of the greatest basketball coach since Coach John Wooden, this is a message to the Los Angeles Lakers: you can't have our coach. So, Cal had asked me to talk about the particular case of Libya in terms of the deal that was struck with Libya back in 2003, where you may recall that the basic terms of the deal were Libya agreed to dismantle all of its weapons of mass destruction programs and cease its support for terrorism in exchange for the lifting of a whole series of sanctions, U.S., European Union, United Nations, Security Council, as well as the beginning of the normalization of relations with Europe, with the United States, and with others. Of course, there have been many ways of looking at that deal at different points in time. The particular moment gives us another perspective on it. So let me draw out what I think are three parts of the debate about what the lessons of Libya are for thinking about the Iran case and bringing Iran in from the cold, and then end with a couple of comments about where I think the implications are for U.S. policy, kind of building on what Charlie said, but leaving a lot of that for the other panels. So one argument that's made is that while the case of Libya appeared to be successful in the short term, after all, they did give up their WMD without a war like in Iraq, and that they did end their support for terrorism, pretty much, not totally, but pretty much, that it was counterproductive in the long term. And here let me quote Aisha el-Qaddafi, the daughter of Muammar Gaddafi, who said the other day, quote, "Is this the reward we get? This would lead every country that has WMD to keep them or make more, so they will not meet the same fate as Libya." So the notion of nukes as a vital insurance policy, people arguing that, look what happened to Gaddafi, the West and the international community invaded, and maybe Kim Jong-il and Pakistan have got this right by having nuclear weapons. Aisha al-Gaddafi is not exactly an IR theorist that our students read in their seminars, nor a foreign policy strategist, but you could see the sort of common sense logic coming out of this. And so the implications of this argument, if this were to be the lesson drawn, and the nature of these things is there's not a single set of lessons. We can argue which one's the most significant, but different audiences, as it were, draw different lessons. One implication would be deproliferating the proliferators is going to be that much harder. Okay, if you are Iran and you worry about regime change from the outside, and you look at what North Koreans are doing and Libya, you might say to yourself in Tehran, all the more reason to proceed with developing nuclear weapons capacity. Secondly is non-proliferation. That is, stopping countries like Iran and others from actually getting nuclear weapons capacity is also going to be that much harder. Because of the incentive of, well, we're not sure we absolutely need them, but it is an insurance policy. This goes well beyond the Iran case to the broad challenges for the non-proliferation regime, for which Iran is a key case, but there are many others. And as we think about, the broad question of the weaknesses of the non-proliferation regime, there are those that are going to draw this lesson from Libya, that it's a vital insurance policy. Gaddafi didn't keep his insurance policy, and oh my goodness, look what happened to him. Second kind of line of argument about the lessons of the case is, for those who called it a success, do you still deem it a success? Was it actually a success? Does what happened since then, Gaddafi didn't exactly change in terms of the way he ruled his country. Democracy didn't follow. Human rights respect hardly followed, and the like. And I would argue that, yes, it still is a success, that foreign policy fundamentally is about defining your objectives and achieving them. And the fact that you don't achieve everything doesn't justify, well, I always got a little piece, therefore it's a success. You always have to do a net assessment. But the objective that was pursued through that 2003 deal had value in and of itself. We did achieve our priorities. He did dismantle his WMD programs. We got substantial counterterrorism cooperation against branches of Al-Qaeda. There were some business opportunities for American companies. Again, you can disagree with those objectives, but those were the objectives defined by policymakers, and they were achieved. Was more possible to be achieved? I think, along with Charlie's comments and this really excellent book he's written, I don't think that it was. I don't think that the notion that it would lead to democratization comes almost from an ideological sense that sort of B would follow A. And there were interests that were achieved on both sides through this deal. Moreover, if Gaddafi did have WMD, and he did proceed with what he had proceeded with in terms of the repression, moving towards even more mass killings, would we have been able to act? Now, for those who may oppose the intervention in Libya, you might say counterintuitively, well, actually, that would have been a good thing. Actually, I'm one that supported it and wrote a couple pieces early on in the New York Times and elsewhere about why. I'm not as convinced that our strategy since making the decision has been as successful, and we can talk more about that. But I think it was the right decision, made in the right ways, with broad cooperation from the Arab League, the GCC, the UN Security Council, and others. And that if he had WMD, would we have been able to prevent what appeared to be the likelihood, of massive killings in Libya? I don't want to call it a genocide and use that term as a particular legal and technical definition, but it would have been mass atrocities. So I think that the second point, I think there are still lessons here about how you can strike a deal with a regime that you don't particularly like, that doesn't change everything about it, but does achieve certain important objectives that you have. Third is to think about, why did Libya agree to this deal, and what are the implications more generally for Iran? This became a classic case of the forced diplomacy debate. The deal was announced in December 2003. President Bush, Vice President Cheney, John Bolton, all of the others basically said, you see, he did this because we invaded Iraq. It showed that we were out to get him. Force works. It sends lessons, et cetera. I actually wrote a long piece about this back in 2006 with a colleague of mine, then a graduate student, now a professor at UC Irvine, Chris Whitetalk, in which we made an argument that basically said force is never not a factor. The very fact that the United States has military capabilities registers, particularly in regions like the Middle East. But that if you were Gaddafi and you're looking at the United States in December 2003, after everything had gone wrong in Iraq, you might well have calculated that, well, it makes it even less likely they're going to come and get me. The whole world's mad at them. They're already tied down in Iraq. It's not likely they're going to do that. And moreover, there was a whole series of diplomacy that goes back to the 1990s that actually started with the British and the Clinton administration got very involved in its last few years, was discontinued for a while by the Bush administration and then picked up again after 9/11. And the argument we make here is one that the deal with Libya was much more about diplomacy than force. And that there were three aspects of this if you think about diplomacy as strategy, not just process. Let me just lay these out quickly. One was the notion of proportionality, that you were using certain policy instruments. Indeed, there were sanctions in the early 1990s coming out of Pan Am 103 and terrorism against a French airliner over Niger, in which Libya was involved. The UN Security Council passed 2 sanctions resolutions in 92 and 93, first time it ever imposed sanctions for reasons of terrorism. And that was one of the instruments, and that there's a proportionality between the kinds of instruments you use and the objectives you have. This was about policy change, not regime change. And the notion that sanctions can bring about regime change is very disproportional to the nature of the policy instrument that's in your hands. There was a lot of trust building that went on, the whole series of negotiations, many of which were quiet, again through the 1990s and the like. Secondly, was a reciprocity that was sometimes explicit and sometimes a tacit understanding of linkage between the carrots we offered and the concessions they made. It was very deft diplomacy. You know, we often look at the military strategies of our great military heroes. I asked my students the other day in a seminar, you know, who can name great diplomats in recent American history versus who can name, you know, generals like General Petraeus, General Clark, who's with us. And it was very interesting. People knew the generals more than the diplomats. Well, this was a story of tremendously deft diplomacy. There was a calibration so that we were neither providing too much for too little, nor too little for too much on the Libyan side. And so the deal preceded certain sanctions were lifted until we got to 2003 when the full deal was made. And third was a notion, of course, of credibility, that, as Charlie said, there has to be consequences for non-cooperation. There was some coercion use, sanctions. But in my view, actually pretty much taking force off the table was more important than standing there and wielding it like a club over their heads. Because if you're seeking to build trust and you're trying to avoid the situation in which the regime you're dealing with says, if I make a concession, they're going to think I'm weak and they're going to come for even more, it makes it much more likely in some ways not to sort of just be out there threatening to use force. And I think that pertains, you know, along Charlie's comments to the Iranian case as well. One of the keys was the domestic politics. This is not a democracy, but we use the terms of you look among the elites in a society, business elites, bureaucratic elites, military elites, scientific technological elites, along much of the work that Adel's done, for what we call, are they transmission belts or are they circuit breakers? To the extent that the demands of the external world community are against the interests of key elites in the society, they act as circuit breakers, breaking the pressure of what's coming in from the outside and not transmitting it inside the country. To the extent that the concessions being asked by the international community are reasonably consistent with the interests of elites, they act as transmission belts, transmitting that pressure into the society. And in the Libyan case, the economy had gotten so messed up. There were threats internally from groups associated with al-Qaeda and a variety of things that certain elites around Gaddafi, their interests would be served by kind of striking the kind of deal that would begin to get Libya opening up more in trade and the like. I think that's a very interesting aspect as we look at Iran and try to figure out the role of elites in Iranian society post-June elections 2009, in the context of everything else that's going on in Iran now, a certain amount of struggles between the supreme leader and Ahmadinejad, at where might be the transmission belts to try to get things going. Last point I think I want to make is in relation to this question of if these are the analytic and the policy lessons, how do you translate them within the context of American domestic politics? You know, and I've spent time in government, I've worked on any number of presidential campaigns, and, you know, if in the Cold War, the three words that most American politicians sought to avoid the most were soft on communism, you know, since the Islamic Revolution and since 9/11, it's been soft on terrorism, soft on Islamic fundamentalism. One of the major achievements, go a little bit off topic, of the killing and capture of bin Laden by the Obama administration, I think, is that the notion that people can argue that Obama is soft or a wimp is pretty much off the table. And that's going to be very helpful to the administration politically, because it's easy to say you're making concessions politically to a regime that we don't like and the like. But these things do take time, and they do take strategy, and sometimes you have to not be talking publicly about the measures that you're making. I share the view of Charlie. I think that a nuclear Iran would be highly problematic, not only for Iran and the Middle East, but for the broader non-proliferation regime. But I also share the view very much that going to war or taking military action would be very counterproductive. For all of the efforts the Obama administration has made to try to change the dynamics of perceptions of the U.S. In the Arab and Islamic world, you know, using military force against Iran, particularly in the context of all the forces unleashed by the so-called Arab Spring, I think would be extremely counterproductive. And here I'm not just talking from a normative or value sense, but in a fundamental, realistic, realpolitik sense. In American politics, there's always these pressures. They make good one-liners. They make good bumper stickers about being soft. And the Libya negotiations were kept secret almost the entire time they were going on, precisely for those reasons. And so I think that we have to understand that there is a policy logic to trying to find a basis for a deal. To me, the Libya case gives one a prudent basis for thinking that similar deals can be worked out with Iran. It's not, you know, surgically transplant from one case to the other, but you do draw some lessons. And to do that, not only is the ball in Tehran's court to see where they're going to respond and how the swirl of domestic politics there may affect it, you know, what their perceptions are of the Arab Spring. I'm not sure I actually agree with the notion that they've been strengthened by this. I think that the alternative narrative, the ways in which change is happening, potentially the empowerment of other groups. In fact, in some ways, I think one of the temptations for us politically is, you know, in the same way in the Cold War, we saw so much change in the Third World is all about Soviet monolithic communism and made some of our huge mistakes. We're going to have to avoid that temptation in Bahrain and elsewhere to strictly define it, you know, as about Iran. So I think there's some real opportunities there, and to the extent that we can try to find ways to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, perhaps bring them more broadly in from the cold through strategies that have a mix of coercive elements but are fundamentally about diplomacy, it would serve American interests as well as, I think, the interests of the region in some very fundamental ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Cal. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I'm happy to be in my alma mater. And in speaking to the issue of, excuse me, how to reintegrate states into the family of nations, I'll divide my comments in two parts. The first will discuss, from my own research, some, excuse me, can I have water? Thank you. Thank you. Findings from my own research regarding which countries seek to rehabilitate themselves, in Cal's language, in the eyes of the international community, and why. And second, building on this, I'll discuss the issue of international sanctions, or positive inducements and negative inducements by the international community, and when and why there might be a chance for success. So part one, which states seek rehabilitation and why? In simple terms, states are more likely to seek rehabilitation when they are led by leaders and ruling coalitions seeking integration in the global economy. That's sort of the basic idea. Why? Because these regimes strike a bargain with their populations. We will give you economic growth and stability. That requires greater integration into the global economy, and it also requires taming military expenditures relative to GDP. It requires regional stability, domestic macroeconomic stability, to attract foreign investment, access to global capital markets, technology, goods, human resources, etc. This is a package, a grand strategy with synergies across the domestic, regional, and global arenas. And I label these internationalizing grand strategies or internationalizing regimes, seeking growth through internationalization as a grand strategy to survive in power. Internationalizing coalitions or leaders benefit from a good relationship with the international community, which helps them deliver goods at home. And examples of states that have come back from the cold through this mechanism are abundant in East Asia, for instance, from South Korea to Taiwan, Indonesia, Vietnam, with its Doi Moi process of economic reform, and of course, China. I'll come back to China later in the context of a contrast between China and Iran. The flip side of the story that I just told is, why do other countries resist rehabilitation? States that are more likely to resist rehabilitation are often led by leaders and ruling coalitions rejecting integration into the global economy. And I will label this inward-looking regimes, because these leaders seek legitimacy not through integration in the global economy, but rather through resistance to it. Their political currency is nationalism, self-reliance, sovereignty, economic protectionism, and defiance of international institutions, economic, security, etc. This position of this ideology or strategy of self-reliance goes by different names: Swadeshi in India, Chuche in North Korea, etc., etc. Patria o muerte in Argentina under Perón, since you mentioned Argentina. So take, for instance, Iran, where the state, including the Revolutionary Guards, controls over 80% of the economy, 80%, among the largest state sectors in the world. Inward-looking forces there are vested in the protectionist status quo because it allows them to continue to dominate and expand their presence in the economy. The Swiss COF Index of Globalization found Iran to be among the least globalized economies in the world, near Rwanda and Niger. Other examples of inward-looking regimes include, of course, North Korea, Burma, Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, and historically Argentina under Perón, and of course Iran. Now, the two models, inward-looking and internationalizing, have implications also for nuclear choices. Internationalizing coalitions have incentives to avoid the costs of nuclearization in money, sanctions, and impaired access to international goods, markets, capital, etc., other resources to maintain or make their economy competitive. And here is the generic logic of this. Without international rehabilitation, to use Carl's word here, without international rehabilitation, it is much harder to achieve a competitive economy. Without a competitive economy, economic growth is far more difficult. Without economic growth, staying in power becomes more difficult. Even Ahmadinejad understands this logic. But East Asian leaders from Japan to Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and others have avoided acquiring nuclear weapons, although they had incentives to do so, including the presence of not one, not two, but 4 nuclear weapon states in the vicinity: China, North Korea, and Russia. But resisted nuclearization. Countries like Japan, for instance, resisted nuclearization because of countervailing incentives. By contrast, inward-looking regimes incur fewer costs when they tinker with illegal nuclear programs because they're less dependent on a good international reputation, access to markets, technology, investments, institutions, etc. Those regimes, those coalitions protect uncompetitive national industry, sprawling state military-industrial complexes, and they consider nuclear weapons useful for reinforcing the inward-looking logic of their regime. Nuclear weapons in North Korea, for instance, are conceived as tools of regime survival that enhance domestic support from the military-industrial complex, the Songun military first policy, and of course, nuclear weapons are very useful for the ideology of Chuche, self-reliance and autarky. There's no time to elaborate on this. I have a flyer. The book, Nuclear Logics, has an extensive discussion of both Iran and North Korea, as well as other countries, including Libya and others. Let me just move quickly to part 2. What does this all mean for the ability of the international community to influence the domestic balance between internationalizers and inward-looking forces? So I explore this issue in the midst of exploring this issue in a collaborative project to be published by Cambridge University Press. How do positive and negative inducements work given this landscape, this domestic landscape that I just briefly discussed, given the different incentives of these two different coalitional types? So the international community faces several dilemmas. I don't have time for more than two. I'll begin with the first one, is the fact that autocratic, inward-looking regimes account for most of the cases of non-compliance with international commitments with the International Atomic Energy Agency, for instance. Hence, these regimes have also been most frequent targets of sanctions and positive inducements, both. However, the very structure, composition, preferences, and strategies of inward-looking regimes also make them more resistant to external inducements, particularly negative ones, but also positive ones. Let me give you some examples. But in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the most frequent targets of international influence attempts are also expected to be the least vulnerable to them, or the most indifferent to both sanctions and most positive inducements. So this is sort of a little, although I share most of what was said up to now this morning, these are the questions that make engagement very intractable. The capacity of North Korea's regime, for instance, to absorb the adverse consequences of sanctions has proven extraordinarily high, surviving widespread famine and the death of nearly 1 million people. The capacity of Iran's hardliners has been also high when oil prices were high, but lower when oil revenues diminished. Now, positive inducements, as we learned from Bruce a few minutes ago, have worked in Libya because of a happy convergence. You know, the opposite of the perfect storm is happy convergence. There were many factors, and you nicely described them. In 2003, but one of the factors, and I think Bruce is right on this, includes Gaddafi's incentives to open up its economy, which were there even before. They call this process infitah, economic opening. Basically, the attempt to launch an internationalizing strategy of sorts, of the kind that I described before. One should remember that unlike Ahmadinejad, Gaddafi was not able to sell his oil under sanctions. So he had the added inducement of getting to that wealth in some fashion. But positive inducements, they may have worked in that case, they haven't worked in many other places. According to Haggard and Noland, for instance, North Korea's Kim Jong-il has only been responsive to positive inducements or engagement, the inducements that are under his direct control and benefit his inward-looking Songun military-oriented constituencies. So anything that yields taxes, food and fuel transfers, fees from the Kaesong Industrial Park, or direct cash payments work. But what happens is that all of that reservoir of goodwill from the international community gets converted into basically a stronger, inward-looking autocratic regime in North Korea. So he has blocked any external benefits that might stream to constituencies favoring foreign trade, investment, and greater openness. Because openness threatens the regime's existing grants and enables unwanted information flows into the country that he would consider as factors that weaken his power. Hence, for instance, the many positive endorsements that China and South Korea have provided for North Korea had very few concrete benefits. And this pattern, of course, also raises the problem of moral hazard, encouraging the very behavior that one is seeking to prevent in the first place. So positive endorsements have also been tried with Iran, and we heard this morning a little bit about it, particularly under President Clinton and President Obama. Turkey, for instance, seeks to trade extensively with Iran as a positive endorsement. The Turkish President Abdullah Gül seeks to triple a 10 billion trade with Iran in the next few years. The chairman of the Turkish, Iran, and Middle Eastern Trade Development Association also expressed strong incentives to trade with Iran. But he also acknowledges that Iran has, and I'm quoting, a horrid customs tariff for protection, end of quote. This is, of course, exactly what you would expect from a protectionist ruling coalition that refuses to give up the chicken that lays the golden eggs, an inward-looking economy. This is also the reason why Iranian leaders are not at all that interested in access to the WTO and the economic reforms that come with it. They say occasionally, yes, we are, but the real reforms that would entail entry into the WTO, no, they are not ready for that. It would totally undermine the foundation of their domestic power. To reassure protected constituencies of their continued monopoly over the economy over Iran, Ahmadinejad declared, for instance, and I quote, "We welcome sanctions," acknowledging that sanctions have actually made his camp stronger. The Obama administration's open door policy to negotiations is effective, I believe, in driving a wedge within Iran's ruling coalition. Existing cleavages, for instance, within the Revolutionary Guards could arguably support a turn toward moderation, but this would hinge heavily on Iran's top leadership steering that shift in the same way as the Chinese leadership did in 1979. However, as of early 2011, the purge of reformist-oriented guards by more radical peers does not bode well for a China-style internal transformation. Quickly, a second dilemma, and then I go to some conclusions. The second dilemma stems from the fact, and I think Bruce alluded to this, that these inward-looking regimes that I have identified here have often been, that have been offered incentives and threatened with sanctions, tend to be what I would label serial transgressors. North Korea, for instance, is also involved in human rights violations, terrorism, narco-trafficking, money laundering, and other illicit behaviors. Iran, of course, as well. So these, and Libya, of course, serial transgressions raise the dilemma of whether one should link compliance in one issue area, let's say human rights, with other issue areas, or create a hierarchy of issues that must be complied with in some sequential order, what we didn't do on Libya, for instance. There are serious debates over this. It's just a problem that has to be tackled, the problem of serial transgressors. I had a paragraph on Syria as a serial transgressor, but I don't have time, and so I'm going into the conclusions very quickly. One, as many cases suggest, domestic dynamics are crucial for shifting toward an internationalizing path. China's 1979 shift was primarily internal, and the US responded appropriately. Two, external efforts, positive and negative, should be designed with an eye on their domestic distributional consequences in target states. Do these efforts benefit internationalizers or inward-looking constituencies? That should be the litmus test. Number three, most instruments designed to influence domestic developments have unintended effects. So for instance, external military threats tend to have the opposite effect than the one desired. They often strengthen inward-looking constituencies or factions by rallying around the flag. Security guarantees can deflate the regime's ability to manipulate external threats for its own purposes. Positive economic inducements may make sense to benefit economic reform, but proceeds can also be pocketed by inward-looking forces. So there are all these issues with positive inducements as well. Number 4, efforts by the international community to reintegrate countries should be pursued under no illusions that they will work effectively for inward-looking regimes, for reasons that I spelled out in the last 10 minutes. And finally, the bottom line is how to turn an inward-looking regime into an internationalizing one. China-style economic reforms encouraged by the international community are probably the golden bullet, but not one that Kim Jong-il, Mugabe, Assad, the Burmese junta, or Khamenei have been willing to bite. They fear that such reforms have the potential to hasten their own demise. Ironically, however, the absence of reform can become an even greater danger to their regime than reform itself. So Kim Jong-il, Ahmadinejad, and others are studying the rest of the Middle East very carefully. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank all three of our panelists for a very interesting opening for today. I have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask a few, and then we'll open it up for discussion. There were many themes that arose that I think cut across these comments. Let me start with one very specific, which is the issue of nuclear weapons. So this came up repeatedly. One could interpret, for example, in the case of Libya, as Bruce suggested, that this would that there's now a greater desire to acquire nuclear weapons as a kind of ultimate insurance policy. The question that I have is, what is the significance of that? So for example, I'm thinking of, we talked about China and the US-Chinese rapprochement of the 70s, where you had two very powerful states wielding a lot of weaponry, who perhaps had the confidence to re-engage. Détente, similar story. Is it possible, or to what degree is it possible, that the acquisition of nuclear weapons or other forms of military power that are of a high nature would permit greater engagement and resetting of relationships rather than impede it? So in other words, what is the real effect of a world in which we had more nuclear weapons? Would we have fewer transitions in relationships, or would it make those transitions harder? So anyone who wanted to begin on that topic, Charles, Bruce, Patel,
Make
please.
a quick comment. You know, I think, Kyle, that I would say let's take a case-by-case approach to that proposition, and that there are some regimes, more stable regimes, less ideological regimes, for whom the possession of nuclear weapons could be an asset and allow them to get to yes, give them some wiggle room that they would not otherwise have. There are plenty of people in our business, and they tend to be the sort of traditional realists, the John Mearsheimers of the world, the Steve Waltz of the world, who believe that an Iran with nuclear weapons will behave no differently than any other country with nuclear weapons. That is to say, risk-averse, cautious, and that in the end of the day, we could get to a more stable outcome if Iran had nuclear weapons than if it did not. I don't buy that. I think the Iranian regime has demonstrated time and again that it is not an ordinary regime. I don't even want to contemplate what could happen if Iran had nuclear weapons. We don't want to go there. And so I would be very, very reluctant to sort of say, well, you know, nuclear weapons are caution-inducing instruments, so let's not worry so much about it. I worry a lot about it, and I would, as I said, be very skeptical of thinking that this regime will play by the same rules of nuclear weaponry as other regimes that we've seen in the past.
Other comments, Bruce?
Just quick, just three very quick points along those lines. One is, with all due respect to Aisha al-Qaddafi, that I quoted at the outset of my remarks, I don't think the argument, the insurance policy argument, is going to carry the day. It may be in play for Iran, but for the factors that particularly Edel pointed out, there's a lot of other factors that can affect the decision of this regime, and I don't think it's going to be, you see, if Gaddafi had him, he wouldn't have been invaded. I think it's part of the mix, but I don't think it's the crucial factor. Secondly, I share many of Charlie's concerns about the regime. You know, it's a really interesting question. You know, some people, like Charlie cited, assume that a nuclear Iran could be deterred. And other times the assumption is they couldn't. I think it's a question that one has to really analyze. And getting at the domestic politics of this, you know, the notion that one would try to analyze this, there were huge political pressures. I'm not going into too much detail back in 2009 on, you know, if there was any effort within the government, the U.S. government, to study this question seriously, to do a net assessment, and it leaked. There were all sorts of people out there that were going to say, you see, this really proves you're not serious about preventing them from getting nuclear. And I think that's a huge problem, because you have to do contingency analysis. And I don't assume that because China or the Soviets could be deterred, Iran could, but I think it's really, to me, a little bit of an open question. And the last point, I think, is having said that, even if the conclusion were that it could be deterred, I still think it's crucial to prevent it from happening through diplomatic means for any number of reasons. The cascading effect in the Middle East. There are many more Arab states that were talking about getting nuclear weapons than there were with the notion that Israel presumably has them, because we know that one of the reasons states get nuclear weapons is for prestige, not just for security reasons. And the broader implications for the non-proliferation regime. If Iran and North Korea and Pakistan, you know, prove to be unresolvable problems, we don't really have a lot left of a non-proliferation regime in an age in which it's all the more important, given non-state actors and others, that we have a strong regime.
So once again, is this working? Hello? I agree with all of your remarks. The Iranian regime, well, first of all, the generic question of whether more is better is one that I completely line up with my colleagues in here. I never abided by it, whether it's Iran or somebody else. More is not better. These are weapons that can be used. They haven't, except for once, but they could be used. Fewer, the better. And there is talk now about going to zero. Nobody has them.
Let me just clarify, though, not whether more is better in the abstract, but is more better in terms of the specific issue of resetting relationships? Does more give the confidence to reset?
Yeah, I don't believe so, and I believe that the Chinese-U.S. rapprochement that I alluded to in my talks is an entirely different proposition. China, of course, exploded a nuclear test in 1964. It was a fait accompli, but the idea was China wanted to open up to the global economy, and Nixon obliged, and it was sort of a perfect match. You don't have that in Iran at all. You have a pretty unrelenting regime that really has not responded to any of the overtures, including by the Obama administration. But there is another issue. The WikiLeaks displayed the true preferences of Gulf countries with respect to Iran. They do feel threatened. I think a nuclear Iran would multiply instability several-fold. And briefly, to go back to comparisons with other countries, Iran is probably the only regime out there, if I remember correctly, that has threatened to destroy another UN member state. So I don't think the rules apply very well to that one case.
Can I just add one quick point? I think that you're getting at a very important piece of the equation, and that is that reassurance and a certain diminishment of vulnerability can help advance reintegration. And so I would say that as part of the dialogue that needs to take place, regional security issues, normalization, things that can give Iran the perspective of feeling safer are very important. I just wouldn't include nuclear weapons in that package because I think the dangers are too high.
Yeah, just one thing on that the package that's been on the table since I think Javier Solana put it on the table for the European Union in 2008 and has continued in this administration includes, negotiations to create regional security mechanisms, whether it's the broad ones that were pursued as part of the Madrid process or more Gulf-specific ones. So that is the point that both my colleagues made about security assurances being extremely important, because if you are Iranian and you worry that the United States might seek to do regime change, we may say, oh, you don't have to worry about it, but if you look at history, they feel like they've got a basis to worry about that.
Yeah, I completely agree with every word you said, Bruce, but in addition, I've actually explored this issue of how much of a threat there is in Iran. How much of a perception that there is a security threat, meaning that the U.S. is bound to sort of attack or anything. I got quotes from, former ministers of defense, the defense community, and it's very clear that they don't believe for a moment that the United States will do something of that nature at this point, which deprives them of the ability to wield it domestically as a tool, because there are no threats out there that are virtually every public of Gates, the CIA chief. I have the quotes. I'm sorry, I didn't bring them with me. All of them are on the record saying military and the military option is not what we're about. And so that is a very good strategy to remove the ability to wield external threats to fuel the bomb project.
Thank you. Let me ask a question about regime type. So, Charlie, you began in your statements, in your opening statement, saying regime type is not a good predictor of behavior. And of course, I think many of us know there is a larger debate, policy debate, social science debate over the nature of regimes and how they may or may not affect their international behavior. Attell made the point that not regime type per se, but a certain propensity to want to engage with the global economy, which might correlate with regime type, matters significantly. So I just want to hear a little bit more about what we mean by regime type and how that might play out in different cases. So is Attell offering an amendment to what you say? Do you disagree, Charlie? How does that, and Bruce, of course, you can weigh in as you wish on this. So, Charlie?
I was referring particularly to the debate, the so-called democratic peace debate. And I'm a skeptic of that debate. And I feel that in certain circumstances, democracy or democratization could actually cause more conflict than less conflict. In fact, we know that from statistical analysis that democratic transitions are actually war-causing, not peace-causing. But I also think that, as I said in my opening remarks, that if there is a rapid democratization in the Middle East, we're actually likely to see more war, not less war. And that some democratic regimes in the Middle East will be much tougher customers than the autocratic regimes that they replace, because autocracy has actually kept down sources of conflict. I do agree, though, with Attell that one does have to unpack the different kinds of regimes, sort of open regimes, closed regimes, and I wouldn't disagree with Attell. I would make one amendment, and that is that I think that there are other ways to sort of unpack or slice the onion. It's not just is the regime internationalist and open, or is it closed and rent-seeking? I think that the Iranian regime, for example, that one could talk about coalitional realignments even within a closed regime and try to peel off those for whom rapprochement with the international community could be used as a domestic political tool, even if it remains largely closed, and that there are security incentives to rehabilitate that have nothing to do with the economic issues. So that's just one piece of the pie.
Bruce, do you want to weigh in? Or?
Sure. I share the view, the skepticism about democratic peace. I think I just used China as an example. I think our relations with China are about interests. And if China were to become a democracy overnight, it wouldn't necessarily change the dynamics of what the core issues on U.S.-China relations are. So I've many of my good friends, liberal internationalists and Obama administration colleagues were much more of that school. I've never subscribed to that. On the current situation in the Middle East, it's true that the value of the diversionary value of Israel or other issues for regimes that are looking for sources of legitimacy may well be there as they compete for different aspects of the political spectrum. And the notion, that we're going through a transition in the Middle East now that the only thing I know is there's not going to be a stable political system in any of these countries for quite a while. Democracy doesn't spring forward like Athena from Zeus's head. It takes a while to build institutions, and inherently in instability are a lot of problems. Having said that, the bargain we had, which was, as they often said, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, was unsustainable. And what we're dealing with now in 2011 is the pent-up problems of sticking with that bargain for so long. So the notion of going back to, friendly tyrants, I think, isn't as much of an option as it used to be. And so for U.S. policy, we have to try to find ways to work with the forces of change. And they're not just going to be all about democracy. They're going to be some hybrid regimes come up, know what our red lines are on crucial issues in the region, and within that be, I think, somewhat flexible about what might not be our first choice, but our governments and relationships that we can live with and work with.
Yeah, thank you, Cal, for, for a very good question, because it allows me to make clear that we have two separate variables here. One is political economy models of regime survival, right? Internationalizing versus inward looking. And on the other hand, we have a second variable, which is regime type, democracy versus autocracy. The two are analytically and empirically different categories. So for instance, you could have democracies that have been inward looking. India is a good case prior to, let's say, the late 1980s, with a very inward looking political economy, but consistently democratic. I would argue that even Israel in the early years was sort of closer to the inward-looking type. And on the other hand, you have autocracies that have been hyper-internationalizers. Taiwan under the Kuomintang, South Korea under Park Chung-hee, and so on, many, right? And they pursued internationalizing strategies that basically yielded all the things that I talked about earlier. What is true, though, is that the convergence of autocratic regime types and inward-looking political economy models, the convergence of those two yields targets that are especially resistant or hardened against external inducements, particularly sanctions. And look at all the cases, Mugabe and so on. That combination is a very intractable one. Having said that, let me just move to regime type that I didn't discuss at all on this. I think I side with Bruce, not because I believe democracy isn't a good thing to have. It is a very good thing to have. But I see, for instance, going back to Argentina and Brazil, countries that I studied a great deal, the shift from sort of a situation of rivalry or competition to amity, to use a term of rapprochement, that transition took place not under necessarily military regimes or democratic regimes. It took place exactly in 1989, 1990, with some agreements that were signed, under the first ever internationalizing ruling coalitions in Argentina and Brazil under Menem and Collor de Mello, respectively. They understood that getting Brazil out from a sort of hybrid or inward-looking economy and into the world, and look what happened in the intervening 20 years, right? Brazil has made it. Right? Brazil used to be a country that many people defined as a country with a great future that will always be that way. But the future has arrived, and what happened then had a lot to do with it, and a situation of stability and friendship with Argentina had to be part of the package. I agree also that in the case of China and the US, it wasn't sort of a democratic meeting of the minds at all. But the last point I want to make about this sort of relationship between these two different kind of drivers, the last point I want to make is that to the extent that internationalizing political economies lead to democratic regimes, and they have done that in Taiwan, South Korea, and many other countries, but not China and Singapore, for instance. But to the extent that they develop a middle class and they develop more beneficial conditions for the emergence of democracy, then the conflation of an internationalizing democracy is, of course, the ideal type of country. You wouldn't have to necessarily, there are built-in incentives in internationalizing democracies to do the right thing.
Thank you.